Hello, and welcome to our webinar on the future of USMCA. I'm Karthik Sankaran, Senior Research Fellow, Geoeconomics in the Global South Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. The Quincy Institute is a transpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C., working for a world where peace is the norm and war the exception. Through our research, writing, and advocacy, we try to move U.S. foreign policy away from domination and military adventurism towards diplomatic engagement. We think this is the best way to secure the interests of the American people and the defense of our country. I'm really delighted to have you all here and to have a very distinguished panel to discuss something that is very much in the news. We had a tumultuous weekend in U.S.-Canada relations, and we are here to talk about what is the future of North American economic engagement, even political engagement. And we have a very distinguished panel of experts to help us. I'm delighted to have with us three people who can shed light on different aspects of what's happening here. We have Juan Carlos Baker Pineda, CEO and founding partner of Consultores Internacionales Ansley. He's a resident fellow with the Georgetown Americas Institute. He was previously Mexico's vice foreign minister, where he played a key role in negotiating and delivering several trade agreements, one of which was, in fact, the transition from NAFTA to USMCA, but also the FTA with the EU, for instance. So very, very delighted to have him here. We have Simon Lester, a non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute for International Economics. He is the co-founder of the websites World Trade Law and China Trade Monitor. He was previously at the Cato Institute's Herbert Stiefel Trade Institute, where his research focused on WTO disputes, regional trade agreements, and the history of international trade law. So he can help us with the weeds, but we'll try not to go too deeply into those weeds because they are real weeds. And we have Rachel Ziemba. Rachel runs Ziemba Insights, an advisory firm that supports clients in macroeconomic scenario analysis, policy due diligence. She focuses on energy and resource markets. She is also an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security and a non-resident fellow at the Gulf International Forum. So let me kick things off by asking about this weekend. I know many people here may be somewhat confused about what even is happening here. We had an agreement, obviously not the experts, but hopefully they can elucidate to us. So let me ask JC. I mean, we had a situation where there was NAFTA, it became USMCA. There's something called a review. There's a deadline for the review that elapsed, and we are still negotiating. What is happening here? What is being negotiated, and what are the consequences of not meeting any deadlines, soft or hard?
Well, that's a very pertinent question, Karthik. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for putting this panel together very timely. Happy also to be with very respected colleagues. To put it very bluntly, we are witnessing, in my opinion at least, we are witnessing a very transformational moment in the North American integration project, because even though that we are now speaking about the USMCA, we have to, remember that in one way or another, the idea of having Mexico, the U.S., and Canada integrated into a market through these agreements, the idea has existed since the early 1990s, right? So we are witnessing a real moment on which that very same project is put under question, okay? And I find very ironic that, well, the country that really is pushing that discussion, it's the United States. I mean, you could probably have argued decades ago that Mexico was a country, or the country that probably could jeopardize the project the most, because, Canada and the US had been these strategic allies for a long time. Having said that, the USMCA included a clause that stated that 6 years upon its entry into force, the three parties, Mexico, Canada, and the US, were going to sit down and review, quote unquote. That is the actual wording of the agreement, review the performance of the USMCA and talk about what could be improved, what could be done better, what other ideas might be useful to incorporate into the agreement. Okay, that a question that I get a lot is why, if the negotiators knew the circumstances that had brought up the negotiation of the USMCA in the first place, why did you guys include that clause? That's a question that I get. And we need to remember that the original intention of the Trump 1.0 administration was actually to have the agreement elapse every 5 years. In the mind of President Trump, the NAFTA or the USMCA was really nothing but a contract. So when you strip it down, a contract can always be amended or terminated. And the intention was that we went through that process every number of years from scratch all over again. Mexico and Canada refused to have that dynamic for the obvious reasons. So what was inserted was this review clause. And there are very legitimate reasons that will suggest that the review is necessary. And if you go back right now to the USMCA text, there's no wording at all about artificial intelligence. And it's not because we forgot about it. It's just that 8 years ago, 10 years ago, that wasn't really an issue. So having this mechanism does allow for the opportunity to bring up new priorities that countries may have. What I fully confess we did not anticipate is that it was going to be Trump again, and it was going to be, in this context, a very aggressive, very protectionist, hostile even, that the review was going to take place. So instead of that, instead of having a constructive, forward-looking, positive review, if you wish, what we ended up doing is not only passing by the first deadline for the review, which happened on July the 1st, this past July the 1st, but also spending political capital, negotiating capital, and efforts and resources all together to try to get to the table. Because previously, well, what the US administration did was imposing these tariffs, and I know it can be confusing and dizzy. The 232, the 301, 338, 122. I mean, it's really very confusing. Let's just say that tariffs were imposed. So the first objective of Mexico and Canada was to, sit down with the US, see how we can lower those tariffs, and then we can talk about what the big strategy is. So you had two processes overlapping, Karthik. On the one hand, the USMCA review that didn't happen, and that's really a shame because that's really what we should be devoting our efforts to. And instead of that we already didn't accomplish, we are negotiating this so-called or this quote unquote ceasefires between the
Hmm.
US, Mexico, and Canada so as to ideally eliminate or at least lower those tariffs on automobiles, steel, aluminum, derivatives, the like, because otherwise it sounds counterintuitive to be speaking about the grand strategy. Meanwhile, you have those duties imposed on our exports. Okay. Now, what happened over the weekend was very, very regrettable. And I'm seeing this downward spiral of rhetoric and measures and countermeasures between Canada and the US. Right now, this week, Mexico, the Secretary of the Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, is in Washington, and Mexico is trying to have some of understanding and perhaps try to succeed in that. But I will stop there because there are several big questions around whether or
Yeah,
not Mexico, first of all, is going to get this agreement. Second, what type of agreement is it going to be? And third, if we do, what does that mean for the USMCA in Canada in particular?
yeah. I mean that's very, and we'll come back to the difference between Canada and Mexico. Kind of nego the way the negotiations have gone is very interesting, and I mean focusing Canada from a couple of points here. One is unless Simon as the as the trade law person, JC already mentioned you have all these different tariffs all these different tariffs floating around. And you have this process where some things are exempt, but clearly other things are a violation of U.S. commitments under USMCA. And one of the lines in Mark Carney's kind of walkout mic drop, so to speak, was these agreements were signed with a pencil. What does that tell you about U.S. intentions? I mean, and I also want to mention the audience. You can ask questions. There's a screen in your box. You can use them, and we will get to questions. We may not get to everyone, but we'll try to answer at least some of the questions from the audience. But anyway, signed with a pencil. What does that tell you about what this administration wants? And is it what the US wants beyond this administration?
Well, first, let me say thanks, Karthik, for having me and for organizing all of this. Good to be here with these distinguished colleagues. So Mark Carney's speech, which was very enjoyable to watch, and those of us who are maybe looking for somebody to stand up to a protectionist trade policy, it gives us some hope. Although, of course, there's some protectionism baked into this response, which is all the whole thing just feels like it's deteriorating before our eyes. If for those of us who support open trade, but so on this specific question here about are things written in pencil? Can this U.S. administration, can the Trump administration be trusted to comply with the agreements? And what about a future administration? So my sense of the Trump administration is it sees all of these statutes that Juan Carlos referred to, the 301s, the 232, and the 338s. It sees all of these statutes as taking priority over the USMCA and any other international trade obligations. So they will observe those agreements unless they decide not to and decide to impose tariffs under one of those statutes for whatever reason. And when they do decide to impose tariffs, they will often have a justification under the agreement. So they'll say, well, this is for national security. We're invoking the national security exception, which they've done many times now. So they'll say tariffs are justified on national security grounds pursuant to this exception in the agreement. So we are in their view or their stated view, we are technically complying with the agreements. Or in the case of these Section 301 tariffs that are being imposed in response to concerns about forced labor, maybe they would say, well, here, these are justified under the public morals exception. So regardless of what their explanation is, and they will generally have one if pressed, they don't feel too constrained by these agreements. So I think that's the written in pencil part right there. So maybe what we're seeing here is sort of this famous saying of we're observing it in the breach. And I feel like that's what we're seeing here. We're observing it in the breach. We're complying when we feel like it, but we're not complying if we don't feel like it. Or we have a justification for why we're not complying. Now, this all sounds bad in various ways. But if you'll indulge me for a moment, I think there's an element here that needs to be considered in this context of thinking about whether the USMCA will be followed in this administration or in future, or getting us to a future administration. It's this situation of basically unconstrained tariffs and violations of the agreement may be bearable as long as it can help us get us to the other side without things getting even worse. And the other side being a new administration in 2029. I mean, you said, what is going. So there's this administration, and there's what will future administrations do. So maybe what we're trying to do is just get to this future administration where perhaps somebody can make an argument for getting back to more normal behavior in U.S. trade policy. Now, is this bearable? Is this worth the sacrifice? It's certainly not ideal. What we would have in for the next couple of years, if this is how things are actually working, or this is what we can hope for, is we would have this feeling of a North American economic relationship, this open trade vibe, but not actually constraining U.S. trade policy or playing much of a role in trade relations. So if the Trump administration, as we've seen, this is how they've acted, and I assume they'll act similarly going forward. If the Trump administration is upset with Canadian or Mexican policies, they will threaten tariffs unilaterally, and USMCA rules will barely enter into this equation. They're not totally relevant. They can be cited from time to time, but they aren't guiding the situation in any meaningful way. And that's terrible. I don't like it. I'm not happy with it. But maybe it's the best we can do for the moment. We keep the USMCA formally in place. We act as if it's the guiding principle for North American economic relations. And then in 2029, we revisit the situation and look for ways to make the agreement stronger and more durable. Now, I love a good speculation. What's going to happen in 2029? Who's going to be the Democratic presidential candidate, the Republican presidential candidate? What will happen in the midterms in the meantime? How do we then, those of us who believe in sort of a more traditional, trade relations governed by international trade agreements, how do we argue for the future U.S. administration to basically to comply with its obligations? That I think is too much for this particular answer and maybe for this seminar, but I think there are people, including me in my head, strategizing about, okay, how do we make the argument that the future administration needs to treat the USMCA as the way that previous U.S. administrations treated international trade agreements, which is mostly comply. I mean, you're never going to get complete compliance, but mostly comply, as opposed to the Trump administration, which, as I said, feels like we don't have to comply at all. I mean, we can and we may. I mean, there's not going to be 100% non-compliance, but if there's a particular moment where they want to use tariffs, they will just do it and cite an exception or not.
Yep, thanks. No, that's very much the case. Actually, I have a follow-on for about the U.S. politics and the silence, but we'll get to that later. I want to ask Rachel now because you focus um, on geoeconomics, well, and I noticed from your Substack, you're always reporting from Canada. I believe I think you worked for at least a couple of Canadian provinces at one point, and you seem to be. What is this situation in the U.S.-Canada dynamic right now? It seems like there's extraordinary animosity, very high levels of rancor. Some of this is driven by domestic politics in each place. But how do you see that developing? And um, wh where do we go from here? Is it possible to come out of this?
Hope it is, and I do think it is. Thanks so much for hosting this, for all you and colleagues at the Quincy Institute are doing to shed light on these interconnections. And thanks also for reading my Substack, Weaponized Economy. I'm probably like selective in when I tell people where I'm writing from. I sort of maybe when I'm in New York, I don't announce it as much. But that's a separate issue, not really relevant for this sort of thing. But look, I think things are in a pretty dark place with the bilateral relationship. I mean, I think you can see that in the opinion polls that sort of cross the Canadian political spectrum. There is a lot of animosity towards Trump and the Trump administration policies, not specifically to Americans per se. There's been quite an extensive travel boycott underway by a lot of Canadians. A real push, I think, over the last year, going into stores and seeing, well, these are Canadian products, buy these, or, which had, sort of materialized. And, but that I think has come despite the fact that there has been a lot of trade continuing. And so, I think the US government, views some of that opinion poll and say, well, Carney wins if he's anti-American and anti-Trump, that helps. I don't think that's necessarily the case. But I do think the domestic political pressures on making a bad deal, or what would be perceived as a bad deal for Canada with the US, are quite high in Canada. And I guess the other thing I would quickly bring us down to is the differences of, by its nature, tariffs are not sort of have the same effect across industries and across geographies, right? So I think one of the things that has been happening is that the differential application of tariffs has reinforced splits between Canadian provinces. And, you really have maybe some of the toughest rhetoric at a subnational level coming from the province of Ontario and Doug Ford, who really got a bigger majority, being anti-Trump. But, and that's partly because they're the heart of the auto industry in Canada and the manufacturing industry. Whereas, Simon and JC sort of have, highlighted the complexity of these tariffs, but whereas the some of the resources, the energy, the uranium, the potash, all of these are areas that even in these recent 338 tariffs were exempt, right? So, and so I think this question in Canada about not just what's the right policy with the US, but what's the right policy to either retaliate, to reshape the economy, and how do you kind of, is this a time where one should have offense versus defense? And I think there's some difference opinion there. I will say, I spent a bit of time yesterday looking at Canada's counter tariffs, in response, and a lot of them are focused in areas that are maybe more defensive. They're sort of tit for tat, they're tariffs on goods from America that also are subject to US tariffs. And, maybe you're trying to build, to incentivize more Canadian products being used. But the challenge is it's hard to diversify, in a meaningful way when you both have geography and you have, 75% of trade going south, not 95 like Trump said, but still 75 is still a lot. And so I think Prime Minister Carney has this tough job of not only sort of keeping these different actors together and in sectors where the provinces have authorities in excess of maybe where some of the states have, and JC can correct me, but I think in excess than some of the authorities that sort of some of the Mexican states have on some of the regulation, including on this new bugbear of sort of sales boycotts of alcohol in many Canadian provinces. So, but look, so I think the challenge, especially on the Canadian side now, just to bring us back to the bigger picture, is we have an environment where the US is reworking trade relationships around the world for for a variety of conflicting goals, right? And where there is this desire to lock other countries into their commitments, but to have the US commitments, maybe this is the signed in pencil, but that they could change at any time. And where I think things have gotten complicated now is this is an environment of deteriorating trust, especially on the Canadian side, so that willingness to accept broad economic security clauses, such as were in agreements with the US signed with Asian countries, we will align on economic security. I think that becomes much more difficult to accept because there's a worry of a blank check, right? What will the next ask be? And it's also really hard. I think I see this in talking to Europeans as well and others. The expectation was trade agreements approved by legislatures, they give business predictability, they reduce red tape. And the environment we're in right now is one where neither of those things is necessarily the case. So it makes it very difficult to make long-term planning decisions. And that may be part of the US goal, right? If you want predictability, come and invest in the US. But I'm not sure that there's a lot of problems, I think, with some of that argument, including the fact that, we can even think about US support for renewable energy and different policy priorities in the Biden administration and the shift in that way. But I'll stop there. I want to hear from the other great panelists.
Yeah, there's, one of the interesting things is that, and I'll kind of tie this to one of the questions here. It does seem as though Mexico has managed to separate the trade docket from some of the more contentious issues that President Trump brought up right at the beginning, the fentanyl tariff right off it, and there was a lot of particularly the first term, at least the public rhetoric was quite hostile. And it seems to me that Mexico has managed to separate these things. And one of the reasons may be that I've always thought that what NAFTA did was allow a different path for the Mexican economy because closer links made it much less of a resource of just a resource dependent economy, enabled industrialization that was particularly deep in automobiles. And now one of the things that I see come up repeatedly, and this relates to a question from Mara Lee. Um, uh, what is it possible to get expanded rules of origin, autos, aerospace, chemicals, electronics? How would that take place? That could deepen Mexican industrialization, because that's something that I've heard come up repeatedly as something that Mexico itself would be pushing for, as something that would be consistent with U.S. preferences as well. So bring trying to find points of agreement there. Does that sound right to you, JC?
Um, yes, but there are several caveats here, Karthik. First, to begin with, and I'm sure that Lester can have a more fully legal opinion on this. According to what the USMCA stands right now, as the USMCA stands right now, changes in rules of origin need to be agreed upon by the three parties. So it will be unfeasible for just Mexico and the US to agree on a set of rule of origins, unless they are intending or thinking about having a completely separate agreement, in which case, well, the USMCA is no more. Okay. Um, I will probably also think that depending on how deep those changes run, probably Congress will have to take a vote on that. And I know that there is an ongoing discussion in the US as to whether this is actually necessary or not. I can tell you that in Mexico, substantial changes to international trade agreements need to be ratified by the Senate. Okay, so that's another way, another angle that we need to consider when speaking about this. But putting that aside, yes, there will be several legitimate reasons that I think that the Mexican economy and the Mexican business community, quite frankly, would say I might be willing or accept stricter rules of origin and hence more difficult market access conditions to the US in exchange of, what is it going to be on the table, right? And this is where I think that discussions are going to hit the wall, because in the mind of the US trade negotiators, the whole idea of making stricter rules of origin and just to tighten the market conditions to the US market, is because they are in this quest to reduce the trade deficit. So they believe that if they make those stricter rules of origin equals, or that it will automatically translate into Mexican exporters buying more inputs, raw materials, component from the US. What probably they have not figured it out yet. I refuse to believe that they haven't thought of this, but maybe they just haven't figured it out how. Is that if you make the rules of origin so strict, probably it's just going to be cheaper and easier to send those products from somewhere else around the world and pay the tariff, whatever that might be, than to actually shoulder all the burden that it will imply having these new rules of origin and these stricter conditions. So we might end up, actually disincentivizing trade rules, trade flows, I'm sorry, by changing those rules, rather than bringing this new era of reindustrialization in North America that seems to be part of this drive for whatever those objectives are. They're going to try it. I mean, let alone forget everything that I said. Okay, they are still going to try it, and the point becomes probably the discussion point will become probably more on what industries, to what degree, right, and how quickly those changes can be enforced. And to close, when we did the changes in the rules of origin for the automotive sector from NAFTA going into the USMCA, the previous rule was 62.5%, already the strictest rule for the automotive industry anywhere in the world. And we did those changes to go up to 75% over the course of 5 years. Okay, so if those changes are indeed proposed and accepted, right, and we amend the USMCA, that it will not produce the immediate result that the driver of the policy seems to be expecting. Okay.
It's interesting. I mean, you have a situation where right now the rules of origin change that's being talked about is a US a minimum US content, not a wage content, which seems to be something that um, my broad sense is that that's actually not that bad for Mexico because the wage differential is sufficiently large in that case, whereas in the Canadian case, it's it's smaller. So if you have a minimum US content, then the most likely victim of it, Canada is probably more likely to be a victim of that than someone else. And similarly, there's also the question of uncertainty that it just allows things to industrialize. Put the marginal plant in the U.S., close the marginal plant outside the U.S., and all of this, I can see as something of a strategy. The question is, and this relates to a question that Krista Perez asked, and this for you, Simon, because you're in Texas, the state that has been most helped by NAFTA and the USMCA. They talk about it constantly, but they do so quietly. No one's really coming out and saying this loudly. And Krista says business organization, Mexican government, members of the U.S. Congress, and the former U.S. TSTR, U.S. are providing the administration with information on the importance of the USMCA. And why are we not hearing more of this, do you think? Why isn't Texas saying this is really important to us? It's our largest trading partner. We've done very well out of this.
So I should clarify, I'm not actually in Texas. I'm a
Yes,
non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute, which is in Texas. I will say that I do have one side of my family, was in Texas, and I did go visit Texas when I was growing up. I certainly, you can tell by my accent, I don't speak for Texas, but in anticipation of this question, I thought a little bit about how Texas might think about it. And so, why is this? Why are we not hearing more from Texas or business leaders, people who support the USMCA? And I mean, I think the short answer to this question is the cult of personality that is Trump, combined with his obsession with tariffs. So from what I can tell, there are still plenty of Republican politicians, business people out there who support free markets and free trade. And I think a state like Texas is full of them. Texas does a lot of trade with Mexico, sees great value in that and in the USMCA. But in this political environment, it's very difficult for those Republicans to get their views on trade into the debate or into policy. Trump dominates the Republican Party. He likes tariffs. He doesn't like imports. And if you want to have a role in the Republican Party today, you either have to adopt his view or at least not contest it publicly. Otherwise, you might get some venomous tweets or truths directed your way and maybe a primary challenge, and no one wants that. So I mean, I think a question to think about, and again, I talked earlier about what's going to happen in the future. So will that change at some point? Will we get to a place where traditional free traders in Texas and elsewhere can get their views back into the public discourse? And I would say, let's see what happens in the midterms. Let's see what happens in the 2028 Republican primary. As I said, I think there's still a significant free market, free trade contingent out there in the Republican Party. I think that what the base thinks is a little less clear. I think as long as Trump is around, they'll give him total support. But when he's not around, the next Republican presidential nominee will probably have different views on trade, or at least not care as much about it. And at that point, I would say everything's up for grabs again. I would say it's worth noting here, when you look at polls, what do people think about trade? It is at the bottom of the list just about all the time. Like, people just don't care that much about it outside of, you can imagine, this town in Ohio cares about it. Like, there are little pockets, but generally throughout the US population, it is just not a priority. And so I think that once Trump and his tariff and trade obsession are off the scene, I think it's possible that we'll go back to something more like what we had. I just want to make two quick points about rules of origin before I sort of miss the opportunity. So I agree that like the traditional view how these rules of origin need to be changed within the U.S. would be, well, you got to go to Congress because the USMCA was implementing. Yeah.
Uh, Simon, could you? I actually had a question. Could you explain what rules of origin means? So if you just like
Okay.
basic
So
layman's
yeah,
explanation.
yeah. So you see you've got all these bilateral and regional trade agreements. The USMCA is one. It's a regional trade agreement. And let's say the USMCA says, well, all tariffs on trade between the parties are going to be zero, but it's only for tariffs that qualify and for on goods that qualify, and the way they qualify is through satisfying rules of origin. So basically a certain percentage of the content of a good, so like a car is made up of all these different inputs, a certain percentage has to be from within the parties to that agreement. So in the case of the USMCA, a certain percentage of the product has to be from Canada, Mexico, or the US. And so I think, Juan Carlos said this. So the original, NAFTA, I think it would for autos, it was 62.5% of the car had to be made from, products, inputs from the US, Canada, and Mexico in order to qualify for zero tariffs on trade between Canada, the US, Mexico. So when a car crosses the border from Mexico to the US, they checked what's the percentage of the inputs that came from Canada or US or Mexico. If it got to 62.5%, okay, it's 0% tariff, as per the USMCA. But if it's not, if it's under 62.5%, you pay the normal tariff. So all of these bilateral regional trading agreements we have come with this limitation that the zero or lower tariffs only apply when the content is from the parties to the agreement, and rules of origin are we have certain rules that determine the origin of the product. The product has to be USMCA origin. I don't know. Hopefully that was somewhat clear. It's a technical thing that customs lawyers have to deal with. So my point about the USMCA rules of origin was that they were implemented in US law via a statute. And so arguably, if you're going to change them, which is what the US is looking for, Congress will have to vote on this again through new legislation. But I've heard an argument that the Trump administration may think they can do this without Congress through an agreement pursuant to the Section 232 tariffs. So Section 232 is the statute that says we can impose tariffs for national security reasons. And so they've done that on autos and steel and aluminum, this growing number of products. So in theory,
Custom cabinets.
yeah. And so in theory, what the Trump administration could be thinking is that pursuant to the Section 232 tariffs on automobiles, we can negotiate with both Canada and Mexico a new set of rules of origin and implement them through the Section 232 process and not have to go to Congress. Now, is that legal? I don't know. Nobody knows. It's like you then get into, well, who has standing to challenge it in court, and how what would a court think about this? They've never thought about anything like this. But there is this idea out there that like there's another way to do it without going through Congress. Yeah. So I just wanted to throw that out there before we got too far past.
Thanks, Simon. And I mean, lurking, I mean, the rules of origin, story is, I think there's a reshoring argument. There's there's nearshoring, but underneath this all is China, right? The world's large, a lot of this anxiety is China, the world's largest manufacturer, a third of global manufacturing value added, concern that concern about transshipment. And that seems to be one of the things that helped blow up U.S.-Canada relations was Canada's decision to allow in just under 50,000 uh, EVs. So I'd like to go, actually around the panel, but I'll start with you, Rachel. I mean, how does how it seems that China is a very important and somewhat unspoken. It's certainly not unspoken in the U.S., but how does Canada view it? And JC, I'd also be curious how Mexico views the question its trade relations with China. But let me start with you, Rachel.
So, I mean, I feel like we're in the phase now with US-Canada trade where there's sort of a laundry list on both sides of reasons why it fell apart. Maybe it's a mark of how broad, how many areas the US was trying to reshape trade on, and also maybe the challenges of what happens when you sort of do agreements based off of leverage and tariffs and impose a short window to get things done. It's not clear to me exactly. I mean, I know the US was unhappy with Canada allowing that sort of relatively small amount of EVs in. And there were a lot of questions of like what that means for Canadian industry. And are you sort of, putting Canada more into sort of an auto import country? There's a lot of valid questions. And then there were a lot of people that said, maybe the reason it all fell apart was that was the expansion of the rule that's already in the USMCA that around trade agreements with non-market economies, read China. But, it does strike me that it's not clear that that was the biggest issue. But I do think when we're looking at North American trade and more generally, there is this real tension from trading partners about where the US sees Chinese trade and investment evolving. We are sitting here just a little under a month out from a meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping with questions of where those tariffs are going to end up, with increasing restrictions on the one hand, but a desire from Trump that China buy more US products, maybe more US primary resources. And I do think that, the US on the one hand really would like some elements of Fortress North America, Fortress G7 to sort of raise the bar against Chinese critical minerals or automotives, but they really want to make sure that that has an America First core in it. And I think across the board, you're seeing sort of people line up on that lines. The other thing, I guess I would come back to your just really briefly, your question to Simon earlier, which is, why are people not pushing back? I think there's both this cult of Trump, but also because businesses are, they are in a dynamic where they see tariffs are on the table. They can maybe lobby for the tariffs that help them. And they might not like the tariffs that hurt them, but they like the tariffs that help them. And so I think it's, the coalition's a little more scattered. So that I think becomes a problem. And finally, I think if you're really making big changes on rules of origin, maybe the US can kind of have some side agreement that circumvents Congress. But to Juan Carlos's comments, Mexico's Congress would need to approve it. The parliament would probably need to approve it. And this is something we have seen US ART agreements not fall apart, but hit some roadblocks with some of the Asian economies, with the European Union, that just because the US can play fast and loose with its legislature, other countries might not be able to.
Thanks, Rachel. Jesse, how about China, the China question for Mexico?
Well, the China question is probably behind every single discussion that the US and Mexico, and I would argue also the US and Canada have had. Not with Trump. It didn't start with Trump. That is also something that we need to recognize. And even in the original USMCA, there's an article, right, that people call it the China clause. It's not really, it never says China, but it does say that if Mexico, the US, or Canada are negotiating a trade agreement with a non-market economy, and we know that's an euphemism to say China, the other two parties are going to have a say will have access to what that third party is negotiating. And the assumption is going to sound very familiar to all people in the audience. The rationale for that is that if we, the three of us, are taking on harder obligations, we are going to make greater efforts to deepen our economy. We want to make sure that the benefits of that process, so that endeavor really stay in North America instead of having that, somewhat connected or shipped, no pun intended, to China. Okay. So, I mean, this idea that, suddenly this came up as a last minute request by the US. Again, I was not part of the discussions. I have no way of knowing, but it does strike me as a bit unclear because, we already had that sort of obligation, right? It has never been enforced because we have not gone in that direction. But that is just to tell you that the China question has been around for a while. Now, to be completely honest, I am a sort of a crossroads when it comes to China and the U.S. and Mexico and all of this. Not because I'm defending China. I mean, they don't need me to defend them. I'm far beyond it, far from it. But it is naive, in my opinion, to try to live in a world that China does not exist. I mean, really, are we really going to do that? And the whole narrative by the US falls apart pretty quickly when you see that President Trump goes to Beijing, and then Xi Jinping will come. Some announcements will be made, and knowing how Trump is, very likely, if those announcements are investment announcements, he will have no problem with having those announcements made in the US instead of Mexico or Canada. So if that Chinese company comes and says, I will invest $10 billion, he will be perfectly happy with that. So there's a level of hypocrisy behind all of that. No, regardless, I think that in Mexico, there is a clear understanding that our future is North American by geography, by the economy, by culture, you name it. There are several reasons, but we cannot live in a world that China does not exist. And we need, ideally, the three of us together, we need to sit down and have a serious conversation about what type of relationship we're going to have with China or not, because it's a bit difficult for Washington to expect that Mexico and Ottawa are going to be far more stricter towards Beijing than what they are willing to do. And this is where the idea that's been tossed around about this board of trade that Ambassador Jamieson Greer, has been touting, in which, if I understand it correctly, the idea is to sort of silo certain areas and industries where trade will be okay, but not in the others. So you can come and do microwaves and refrigerators, but you cannot do EVs. I mean, it sounds difficult, but if that is the concept, okay, I think that maybe exploring it from a North American perspective would be not only ideal, but also it can quite honestly shed some light on what are the changes that we need to do in rules of origin, tariffs. It can be helpful in terms of articulating all the other objectives, policy objectives that allegedly we are trying to accomplish together.
I mean, that leads to another question, which is about technology, right? I mean, you have a situation now where USMCA is a strong, or at least was a strong, regionally integrated entity that arose, in fact, in response to Japan and the European complex that then became the ASEAN, so in the early 1990s. But right now you have China, which is a very significant technological player, and part of the EV question is what is the future of the automotive industry? And you're seeing this fight play out in Europe as well, because China is ahead in that, in what seems to be the future of the automotive industry. So what are the costs and benefits um, of work of inclusion versus exclusion in automobiles in particular, which is a key industry across all three states? I'll Simon, you're next in line, so let me ask you, but maybe we can all do a quick bit on that, because that seems to be a big part of what are you giving up in technological terms by excluding China, if
Yeah.
that's the goal.
I mean, I think there may be two aspects to this, at least two anyway, two that come to mind right away. One is, what does that do to the industry in the US or Europe or Japan or South Korea to have the China is so dominant. What does that do for jobs, in those countries? And then the other is, what are the economic security implications of all this? And I think maybe I'm going to focus on the latter. And so the US over the past couple of years has developed a set of regulations about connected vehicles. And I'm not a leading expert on this, but as I understand them, basically the idea is, if China in particular, it's not really spelled out as directly as China, it could be anybody, but I mean, China is one of the countries that is covered by this, and they're the ones making a lot of vehicles. If cars today, old style cars had no software, but now cars, they're all going to have software in them. And so if the cars have software, and that there's data being gathered, and that can be sent back to a foreign country of concern like China, then that is thought of as a security threat. And there are rules in place that will, over the next couple of years, basically ban all of these products, it looks like on paper, from being sold in the US. So if it's a Chinese, if a car produced in China, or a car produced by a Chinese company, it may be that you just can't sell that in the US unless you go through a bunch of hoops to get it approved, which I think is going to be difficult. And so this is an idea that I think is pretty strongly in place now in the U.S. It was something, I mean, I think it started with the Biden administration, now carried over to Trump. So if we got a future Democratic president, I don't know that this would be undone. So we're at a point in the U.S. where we may be saying we can't have any Chinese cars here ever. Now, what does everybody else think of that? The Canadians, as we've just heard, that they're letting in a small number of Chinese cars, electric vehicles. I don't think that they're ready at this point to go for a total ban. I don't think the Europeans are ready to go for something like that. I don't think Mexico is. But the U.S. seems to be going down this really kind of strict road. That's what you would do with a car, no pun intended. Of we're just not going to let any. We don't trust Chinese cars at all on our roads. And I think that it's going to be a challenge for any future U.S. administration who's got sort of an anti-China kick to get broad consensus around this. And I think the rest of the world is probably going to think about it differently. My own view on this is that you need to take these data issues seriously, but it's not really a China specific issue, and you need to come up with regulations that govern what happens to the data that's collected by these cars. Yeah, okay, maybe there's a concern with going back to the Chinese government, but there's just a broader concern with somebody accessing all your driving data, and you need to figure out regulations to deal with that. So I think my hope is that other countries focus on that, and in the process can take care of any Chinese concerns. But in the US, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. For now, it just seems like we're keeping out the Chinese cars. We're not worried about the data. And as I said, I just don't see the US being able to convince everybody else to go along with that.
Rachel?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's worth noting that this Canadian exemption was to 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles that was imposed during the Trudeau government, but the Biden administration, when the U.S. was putting pressure on Canada to have common external tariffs on some of these sectors. So I just don't want to lose that thread, that in a way this is sort of a starting point. But I think Simon's right. I think this question mark about data transmitting and where data is stored is going to become a bigger issue. And there's the vehicle question, this connected vehicle legislation, but we've seen with drones, with inverters, with robotics, the US really used some of these tools that do sort of end up being import bans that are not all China specific. Some of them are broader. And I think we're in an environment now where the ambiguity from the US about, well, what are the risks to other countries is contributing to a circumstance where some of the countries say, well, we don't want our data stored in the United States. We're not sure we want to have that access. So I think it plays into a lot of different, sort of challenges. And there may be a question of, okay, well, which products is it more risky, right? And how do we harden, and by we I mean different countries, but how does one harden infrastructure like power plants and others, and those dynamics? And so I think this is just where this ambiguity about where the risks are comes into play. And Juan Carlos is completely right. This question about China does pervade, I think, just about everything. I guess the issue is more a question mark about sort of where the US policy towards China is going to end up, but also in a time of lower trust and where there are security questions. I think, you know, one shouldn't underestimate the impact that things like the 51st state rhetoric is having, that I think make the Canadians and make some of the Europeans antsy about, you know, sort of technology platforms that the U.S. might cut them off from. So I think there's a few different trajectories, and of course the Chinese risks are so much bigger than the others. But this is an environment where we don't have common rules about how data is handled and a hierarchy of risks yet. And so I think that's going to be part of defining where do we go from here, both within North America, but just sort of more generally.
Thanks. Hey, we're getting close to the end here, so I wanted to just throw out my final question, you know, very quick, you know, to each of you. We can just go through. So we tried. The title is our options are thriving, surviving, zombifying, or dying. So I'm going to put each of you on the spot and say, where do you see USMCA, let's say a year from now and 5 years from now? And if you see one of the worst outcomes, you know, either zombifying is pretty bad, dying is even worse. What do you think the plan Bs are for Canada and Mexico in that circumstance? Because they have lots of FTAs too. So let me start with you, JC.
I think that the USMCA will survive. I have no doubt of that. It might not be the USMCA that we know today, but some form of USMCA will survive. And that probably is not going to happen during the time of President Trump's and the remaining of President Trump's time in the White House, because I just don't see the politics there from the US part, that is, unless this is somewhat connected to the 2028 presidential election, right? But I see definitely the USMCA surviving. I also believe that in 5 years, hopefully, we will, you know, have the vision, the energy, the endurance to talk about what are the real important issues for North America. Because, you know, as you were just asking a minute ago, you know, we're here engaged in the trade deficit question, which is absurd to my point of view, instead of actually having the serious sit down to talk about what are we going to do with technology. I mean, that would be a fantastic topic to delve into, and we're just not paying attention to that one because we're so consumed by the other agenda. No, so I see the USMCA surviving, and hopefully in 5 years we will have the conditions necessary to really speak about what is the next step for North America.
Thank you very much, JC. Simon?
I basically agree with all that. I think that withdrawal by, you know, the Trump administration is just too tough politically. You know, there's a whole constituency out there, Republican legislators, you know, U.S. farm interests, agriculture interests, who want to keep it in place and would object. And I think even Trump, you know, there's limits to his unilateralism. His just, you know, we see. I mean, sometimes it's hard to comprehend, but we actually see there are constraints on his actions. I mean, it feels like there aren't, but there are things that he won't do, lines he won't cross. And I think that trying to withdraw, it would be a political and legal nightmare. Yeah, so I think it will stay in place. And then I also agree that in a few years, you know, there will be a moment where we have a chance to revisit all this and to strengthen it, to, you know, to kind of really sit down and think about, okay, what is the North American economic relationship? I think the biggest difficulty is going to be priorities. So, you know, imagine here we are in 2030, 2031, and there's a new president, and that president is thinking, okay, what do we want to do with North American economic relationship? But the problem is that president will have 50 other things to think about. And you can imagine all the other things going on that will be even worse. Like, we can talk about how bad things are in the North American economic relationship, but oh my God, there's a lot of other things that are even worse. And so, can you get to the North American economic relationship? I would hope so, and I will make the case to U.S. trade policy leaders at the time that you should make this a priority. Our closest trading partners, our closest allies, some of our closest allies, I don't know how do we rank everybody, are Canada and Mexico. They're right there. We need to have a good, stable relationship with both of them. So put that at the top of the list. What do you need to do to get USMCA renewed, maybe even renamed, because what a terrible name, USMCA. Maybe fix this review and renewal process, because that's clearly not great. So how do we put everything on a more stable footing? Put that at the top of your list, and I think it can all be done. But look, I mean, there's economic crises, there's military crises out there. Maybe those take priority and we just don't get to it. But I really
Simon, I'm gonna pass it on to Rachel because we're slightly over the top. But please, Rachel, what do you think?
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I tend to think that maybe there's a version of shrinking, which I know is not one of the options that you gave us. Maybe in the short term, a little bit of zombifying, but it is notable how important and persistent the USMCA exemption has been, even if it continues to be eroded, both by the 232 tariffs and also by these 338 tariffs in the Canadian context. And then just to kind of really, hammer home Juan Carlos's point about the trade deficit not being a good metric. On the Canadians, definitely not for the U.S. Mexico side, but on the Canadian side, if you strip out energy, there is a big U.S. trade surplus with Canada. And if anything, from the points I was making before, the U.S. there's other things that will drive energy, and especially energy prices and fertilizer prices. We've had other discussions about that, but I think moving away from that sort of metric, I do hope that we'll have a point where, in fullness of time, that it will be revisited and brought up to date. And at that point, maybe lessons learned from, trilaterals of what's going on with the Europeans and Japanese might sort of come into the mix. You might see some other things, but look, just you have integrated supply chains, you have geography, and so there's going to be a factor here. I just think we're in a moment where there are industries that are being sort of built, where there's pipelines and other structure that is going to be built and money going behind it that's going to be pushed towards diversification. And so it's just the relationship's going to look different. Maybe in some ways it'll be more interconnected. I've been tracking Mexico's additional pipelines and use of port infrastructure to get U.S. goods to market, for example. So that's something to watch. But maybe we end up, in the interim with sectoral related measures rather than something overarching, and then bring it back together. I just think this is an environment where business is looking for predictability, and business is looking for less red tape and less need. And this is the kind of environment where there's a lot more compliance required for trade across these countries, and actually any trade into the United States right now. And so this is a kind of circumstance that I don't think is good for growth in either of the countries.
Right. Well, thank you all very much for ending on what I take to be a relatively optimistic note, even with some reservations.
Despite my last sentence, I
yeah. So thank you all so much. Thank you for listening to this. If you like this, we have lots of content. We have lots of content like this. We have a webinar on U.S.-China economic relations coming up tomorrow. In fact, if you want to find out more about what we do, our offerings, webinars, briefs, and so on, please go to our website. It's quincyinst.org, quincyinst.org. Check out what we have on the website. You can sign up for our mailing list. And thank you once again for joining us. And thank you to our panelists for such an informative panel and ending on, as I said, a relatively cheerful note. Thank you again. Goodbye.